time being, it's impossible for me to take my family back to the UK safely. Well, for a start, the only time that I've come back to the UK is...
The announcement lasted less than a minute, but the reaction shook the room. Prince Harry had barely heard the final sentence before his expression hardened. His chair moved sharply backward, and he headed for the door. Buckingham Palace had just confirmed something he clearly was not prepared to accept. Prince George held the recognized right to a senior ceremonial palace seat tied directly to the future sovereign. Harry said nothing on his way out. That silence became the first warning. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles watched his younger son freeze before the words had fully settled. The private briefing had been called to settle a question that senior household officials could no longer leave uncertain, because future ceremonies involving William and his eldest child required a clear order of precedence. The palace seat, as the household described it, was a ceremonial position, reserved in this dramatized account, for members standing closest to the direct future line during certain family councils and state-linked gatherings. That explanation sounded technical. To Harry, it sounded brutally personal. William remained silent as the confirmation was read again. George, as his eldest son and the next generation directly behind his father, would hold precedence over his uncle for that position. Harry stared across the room, waiting. He seemed to expect the prince to challenge the wording, soften it, or at least acknowledge what it meant. William did none of those things. His stillness carried its own message, and Harry understood it immediately. Harry pushed his chair backward. "Then you have already decided where I stand," he said, his voice controlled enough to make the sentence land harder. Charles started to answer, but his son was already moving. The king called his name once. Harry did not stop. The door closed behind him, leaving William facing his father, while the officials around them suddenly found the papers in front of them more interesting than the silence. Charles turned on the nearest aide almost at once. He wanted to know whether Harry had been warned that the final wording would directly name George's precedence. According to a documented account prepared after the meeting, the aide admitted that Harry had received the agenda, but not the completed language. That detail changed the king's expression. William, however, looked less surprised. He had already understood where the review was heading, and Charles realized his elder son had known exactly how explosive the announcement could become. Harry reached the corridor and stopped. For several seconds, he gripped the back of a chair, as though anger alone were keeping him upright. Then he released it and kept walking. He did not return. But the real shock was no longer that George had been given the seat. It was why the recognition of an 11-year-old boy's future position had struck Harry like a judgment on his entire past. To understand that, the story had to move beyond protocol and into the relationships that made one palace chair feel like a verdict on an entire life. This was never really about furniture. It was about belonging. Charles saw a monarchy he was responsible for protecting. William saw a future he had been preparing his son to inherit. George stood at the center without having asked for the confrontation at all. And Harry saw something very different. Another unmistakable reminder that the institution which shaped his childhood had now begun arranging itself around a future in which he was increasingly distant from its center. Charles remained unsettled long after the briefing room had emptied. The crown, meaning the monarch and the institution built around the sovereign, placed him at the center of the present royal order. William stood directly behind him as the future king, while George represented the generation expected to follow. That structure mattered because every ceremony, privilege, and position connected to succession eventually had to reflect who carried the monarchy forward. Harry had once stood directly behind his brother. The births of George, Charlotte, and Louis changed that permanently, pushing him farther from the central hereditary line. William felt the cost of that reality in a different way. He returned to Catherine carrying one fear above all others. George was being pulled into a battle created by adults. The prince told her that his son should never feel ashamed of a position he had not requested, and could not simply give away. Catherine understood the danger immediately. If George began believing his future caused pain inside the family, then something meant to represent continuity could become a burden before he was old enough to understand it. Harry experienced the same moment from the opposite side. He did not see George stealing anything from him, but he could not ignore what the confirmation represented. Another place once associated with his proximity to the center had shifted toward the next generation. The decision therefore felt less like George gaining a ceremonial right, and more like another door quietly closing behind Harry. He had spent years watching the hierarchy change. This time, the change had been spoken aloud in front of him. Charles received the next update only minutes later. Harry had left the palace grounds. The king removed his glasses, placed them beside the briefing folder, and asked the aide standing near him, did he leave angry or hurt? The question exposed the real fear underneath everything. Charles understood anger could fade, hurt could remain for years. The aide hesitated before giving him another detail. According to a documented account of the preparations, Harry had specifically asked before entering the meeting whether the seating matter involved family precedence. He had already sensed that something deeper was coming. William had known that too. Yet the future king had resisted speaking privately with his brother beforehand, because he feared any unofficial conversation might make Harry believe the decision itself could still be negotiated. That choice now looked painfully expensive. William had protected the clarity of George's position, but he had also allowed Harry to hear the truth in the coldest possible setting, and the briefing had only exposed the wound. 3 days earlier, inside Windsor, George had been quietly directed toward a chair Harry believed still carried part of his own history. And that single rehearsal had turned an obscure question of protocol into something neither brother could ignore. 3 days before Harry stormed out, almost nobody inside Windsor believed a rehearsal could trigger a royal rupture. There were no cameras, no crowds, and no public ceremony. Yet one instruction changed the atmosphere instantly. As attendants prepared positions for an upcoming family council, Prince George was guided toward the ceremonial seat nearest William's future position. Harry watched from several steps away. Then he asked one question that stopped the rehearsal cold. Since when does that belong to him? Harry did not raise his voice. That made the challenge more unsettling. The closed rehearsal was taking place inside St. George's Hall at Windsor Castle, where household staff were arranging positions for a ceremonial family gathering. A family council in this dramatized story meant a private royal gathering, where senior family members were placed according to rank and future responsibility. The palace seat carried particular weight because it marked proximity to the direct line of succession, and George had now been positioned beside the place reserved for his father. William noticed the change in his brother before anyone answered. An usher had placed George's temporary name marker beside the chair, and Harry immediately asked whether the arrangement had been formally authorized. The prince looked toward his son, who had gone visibly quiet. George did not understand every detail, but he understood enough to know that his name had suddenly become the center of an argument. George looked toward his father for reassurance. William kept his voice calm and told him to continue the rehearsal and let the adults handle the discussion. Harry quickly insisted that his objection was not aimed at the boy. The future king did not accept that distinction easily. He told his brother that challenging George's place while the child was standing only a few feet away made it impossible for him not to feel involved. Harry turned back toward the officials and demanded an explanation. According to a documented account prepared after the rehearsal, one senior household figure confirmed that the seating interpretation had followed a private review requested months earlier by Charles's household. The review, meaning an internal examination of how future ceremonial precedents should work, had already begun shaping arrangements before Harry had been told it even existed. That revelation changed the argument. Harry was no longer questioning one chair. He was questioning how many decisions about his remaining palace status had already been made without him. William understood exactly what his brother was hearing beneath the official language, but he refused to suggest George's position should be delayed simply to soften the impact. Harry reached for his own temporary place card. He lifted it from the table, turned it slowly in his hand, then placed it back face down. No speech followed. The gesture said enough. Charles was informed soon afterward that the rehearsal had broken down over the seating question, and the king realized ambiguity was now more dangerous than clarity. What began as one tense rehearsal had forced a definitive ruling. 3 days later, that ruling would be read aloud in front of both brothers. And when Harry returned to face William after storming out, neither man would have ceremony left to hide behind. Harry did come back, but not to apologize. After leaving the official briefing, he remained elsewhere on the royal grounds long enough for the anger to cool into something sharper. When William finally entered the private room where his brother was waiting, there were no secretaries beside them, and no ceremonial language to hide behind. Harry stood before William could sit. "Just tell me one thing," he said. "Did you know they were going to do this?" William closed the door and faced him. Charles had pushed for the meeting because he feared that allowing both sons to leave with the argument unresolved would turn one painful decision into something far deeper. The palace ruling was already final, meaning the formal decision about George's ceremonial precedence would not be reopened. What remained was more personal: who had known, who had stayed silent, and why Harry had been allowed to walk into the briefing without the full truth. Harry did not soften the accusation. He told his brother that protocol had just said what William had apparently been unwilling to say himself, that Harry no longer occupied the same place inside the working royal family. The prince pushed back immediately. George's position, he said, was not an attack on his uncle. He would not make his son feel smaller simply because the reality of succession caused someone else pain. That answer landed hard, because Harry was not asking for George to disappear. He was asking why nobody had trusted him enough to speak before the announcement. Harry stepped closer. "Look me in the eye and tell me you didn't know." William held his gaze, and for the first time the future king hesitated. According to a recorded private account later summarized for Charles, he admitted that he knew the internal review was moving toward George. He had not known every final sentence, but he understood the direction. Harry's face changed. The anger did not vanish, but something more wounded appeared beneath it. William then revealed the part Harry had not expected. Charles had considered delaying the confirmation because he feared exactly this reaction. The king had worried that announcing George's position, while tensions remained high, could make Harry feel publicly displaced inside his own family. But William had argued against postponement. To him, keeping George's future deliberately unclear simply to avoid confrontation would send the wrong message to his son and to everyone responsible for preparing the next generation. Harry stared at him. The argument had reached its deepest point. William had not chosen this because he wanted his brother humiliated. He had chosen clarity because he believed uncertainty would eventually hurt George more. Yet for Harry, the distinction barely eased the pain. "So you chose clarity over me," he said quietly. William did not answer immediately, and that silence pointed beyond both brothers. Harry had confronted the man who knew the decision was coming, but William had never held the final authority. That belonged to Charles, and now the king would have to explain why he believed delaying the truth would have been even more dangerous. Charles did not celebrate the decision. When the final recommendation reached him, he read it twice, and remained silent long enough for the officials around him to become uncomfortable. His youngest son would almost certainly see the ruling as another rejection. His grandson could become the unwilling symbol of that rejection. Yet the king faced a calculation every monarch eventually confronts. When family emotion collides with continuity, which obligation is allowed to bend? Charles had requested the internal review months earlier because the household needed one clear system for future ceremonies involving William and his children. The review was simply a formal examination of how precedents should be applied as the direct line moved forward. The palace seat was not treated as private property that belonged forever to one person. It followed the succession pathway, which meant the ceremonial order had to reflect who stood closest to the future crown. That made the logic simple. The emotional cost was anything but. Charles waited until the advisors had gone before reopening the recommendation. His finger moved beneath George's name and stopped there. The king knew exactly why Harry might hear the decision as erasure. Years earlier, his younger son had stood immediately behind William, close enough to the center of royal life that every major future arrangement seemed to involve both brothers. George's birth had changed that. Charlotte and Louis had widened the distance further. Now the hierarchy was no longer merely understood, it was being made visible. Charles worried just as deeply about George. He would not allow the boy to grow up believing his proper place had been hidden because adults feared Harry's response. That, to the monarch, would turn protection into shame. George had not created the structure. He had simply been born into it. Charles believed delaying recognition would teach the child that his future became dangerous whenever someone else found it painful. Charles had therefore inserted one strict protection into the final instruction. According to a documented account from the private secretary's office, palace staff were forbidden from describing George's recognition as Harry being removed from anything. The wording mattered because the king wanted continuity without humiliation. But one courtier later admitted in a recorded conversation that the distinction collapsed the moment Harry saw the new order with his own eyes. Technical language could not compete with memory. Charles signed the final authorization anyway. He placed the pen down and looked directly at his private secretary. "No triumphal language," he said. "This concerns a child and my son." The instruction was calm, almost restrained, but it carried the weight of a man trying to protect two generations at once. That restraint would not survive for long. The moment Harry crossed the palace threshold in anger, the decision escaped the controlled language Charles had built around it. What had been intended as a quiet act of continuity was about to become a public family rupture, and Harry was about to discover that nothing outside those walls would describe it gently. The hardest moment for Harry did not come when the announcement was read. It came later, when he finally understood that nobody was calling him back to renegotiate it. The palace was not waiting for emotions to settle before reopening the question. There would be no second vote, no revised language, no compromise involving George's place. Harry had stormed out, believing his anger might force the institution to recognize the depth of his objection. Instead, the machinery simply continued. Harry learned quickly that the decision had already moved from argument into action. Officials began applying the confirmed arrangement to the upcoming ceremony, adjusting the order around William and his eldest son as though the ceremonial arrangement was simply the official placement of family members according to rank and future responsibility. That mattered, because once staff began using it in real preparations, the ruling was no longer theoretical. George's position had become part of the working structure. Charles sent his younger son a short personal message soon afterward. The king did not mention another review. He did not offer a compromise. He asked only to speak as father and son. Harry read the message twice and felt the frustration return. To him, a private conversation risked reducing something larger into hurt feelings between relatives. He believed the issue was about how the institution had decided his place, not simply whether his father understood why he was angry. Meghan heard that tension when she spoke to him by phone. She urged Harry to separate what he felt about the palace from what he felt about George. The boy had not written the ruling, requested the seat, or chosen the order around him. Harry knew that. Hearing it stated so plainly still mattered. His anger had always been directed upward, toward the decisions surrounding him, but now he could see how easily the conflict could fall onto someone who had done nothing. Harry sat alone after the call and reread Charles's message. He placed the phone face down and did nothing for several minutes. The silence forced him to confront something anger had hidden. The ruling was not going away. Refusing to speak would not protect his old position. It would only deepen the distance between him and the people involved. William, meanwhile, had already issued his own instruction. According to a documented account from the communications team, the prince told aides that nobody was to describe the outcome publicly as a victory for George. He understood how cruel that framing could become. George had also asked why his uncle had left so abruptly, forcing his father to explain just enough without making the child believe he had caused the dispute. Harry finally picked up the phone again. This time he typed slowly, "I will talk. Not about changing it, about what it means." Then he sent it to Charles. That message changed the direction of everything. The battle over the seat was finished. What remained was harder. A father and son would now have to discuss what Harry believed the seat had taken away. There were no advisors in the room when Harry finally met Charles. No briefing papers sat between them. No official waited beside the door to interpret what either man meant. For the first time since George's position had been confirmed, the argument was stripped of protocol. Harry did not ask his father to change the ruling. Charles did not attempt to defend every palace procedure. Instead, one son finally told one father what the announcement had actually sounded like to him. Charles had arranged the meeting privately, because both men understood one hard truth. The institutional question was already settled. The constitutional side of the dispute, meaning the formal rules governing rank, succession, and ceremonial order, would not be reopened. George's recognition remained unchanged. Harry entered the room knowing that. What he wanted now was not reversal. He wanted his father to understand why hearing that decision in front of officials had felt like something far larger than a seating change. Harry spoke first. He told Charles that when George's precedence was read aloud, it felt as though decades of his own place in the family had suddenly been reduced to a footnote. Once, he had stood directly behind William. He had grown up believing that closeness meant something permanent, not because he expected the crown, but because he believed his place beside his brother carried emotional weight. Now the system seemed to be moving forward, without any space for what that earlier life had meant to him. Charles listened without interrupting. Then the king answered carefully. "Succession," he said, "inevitably changes positions. Children are born. Generations move forward. The order cannot freeze itself around memories. But family, he insisted, could not be measured using the same ladder." Harry challenged that immediately. The palace kept telling him he remained family, yet every formal decision seemed to make the distance between those words and reality more obvious. Charles finally admitted what Harry had needed to hear. According to a recorded account of the private conversation, the monarch said he should have warned his son personally before the briefing. He should not have allowed Harry to discover the final wording, surrounded by officials, silence, and ceremony. The decision itself would not have changed, but the way it was delivered could have. That admission broke something open between them. Harry then gave his own. He acknowledged that storming out had placed George at the center of a conflict the boy had never created. His anger had been directed at the institution, but the public could easily turn the moment into uncle against nephew. Charles understood the danger. So did Harry. Charles reached across the small table and stopped before touching his son's hand. For a second, neither man moved. Then Harry closed the distance himself. Nothing about the ruling changed, but something between them did. Harry could not rewrite the hierarchy, yet after speaking to Charles, He could decide whether his next action would deepen the wound or finally stop George from carrying it. By morning, the private dispute had become impossible to contain. The words "Harry walks out" dominated coverage, but another name appeared almost as prominently: George. Suddenly, a boy who had said almost nothing was being discussed as the victor in a contest he had never entered. That framing changed everything. Inside the palace, William was furious. Outside it, crowds and cameras gathered. And Harry faced a final choice over whether to feed the confrontation or end it. William saw the first headlines before the household had finished its morning response. Broadcasters were already framing the dispute as a clash between Harry's shrinking ceremonial position and George's growing place in the direct line. Succession precedence, meaning the order that determines who stands closest to the crown and how that order shapes ceremonial rank, had now been turned into a public contest. Palace communications pushed back immediately. The decision, officials stressed, concerned the structure of succession. It was not punishment, revenge, or a personal victory over Harry. Outside Buckingham Palace, the story became painfully real. A small crowd gathered near the Victoria Memorial as photographers captured newspapers being raised toward the cameras. One fictional front page carried the words, "George takes his place. Harry walks." The line spread quickly because it reduced a complicated family wound into one brutal image, one royal rising, as another appeared to fall. That was exactly the interpretation William had feared. William reacted at once. The prince told his communications team that George must never be described as having taken anything from his uncle. His son had not defeated Harry. He had not demanded the seat. He had inherited a place in an order that existed before he was old enough to understand the emotions attached to it. William wanted that distinction protected because he knew public language could leave scars long after the headlines disappeared. Harry felt his own anger return when he saw the coverage. Yet the conversation with Charles had changed what he did with it. Attacking the ruling publicly might defend his pride, but it would also push George deeper into a conflict the boy had never chosen. That recognition stopped him. For the first time since storming out, Harry understood that silence could be restraint rather than surrender. Charles worried that silence might still be interpreted as open hostility. The king considered whether Harry should release a statement, but he refused to order his son to speak. This time, he would not turn another family moment into an instruction. Harry made the decision himself. He sent William a private message with one blunt request: "Keep George out of this. I mean it." According to a documented account of the exchange, the reply came quickly: "Agreed." That single word did not heal years of tension. But it created the first clean moment of unity between the brothers since the crisis began. The palace had established George's place. Harry had accepted that reality. What remained was the final verdict on whether one ceremonial seat had divided 3 generations, or finally forced them to understand one another. In the end, nobody overturned the decision. George retained the ceremonial right that had triggered the crisis. William did not apologize for protecting his son's future. Charles did not withdraw the confirmation he had authorized. And Harry did not return demanding another ruling. That might sound like defeat, but emotionally, something more important had happened. The palace had finally separated 2 questions it had allowed to become dangerously entangled: where Harry stood in the succession structure and whether he still mattered to his family. George kept the palace seat, and Harry accepted that reality without another challenge. The ceremonial position, meaning the recognized place assigned according to the direct line of succession during specific royal gatherings, would remain tied to the boy's future role. William made one point clear to his son afterward: precedence was responsibility, not superiority. The prince wanted George to understand that standing closer to the crown did not make him more valuable than the people around him. It simply meant more would eventually be expected of him. Harry reached his own conclusion more painfully. In a documented private account shared after the family discussions, he acknowledged that his walkout had come from years of accumulated hurt, rather than hostility toward George. The boy had become the symbol of a change Harry was struggling to accept, but he had not caused it. That distinction mattered. Harry refused to let his nephew inherit the emotional burden of a fight between adults, especially one rooted in memories of a royal position that could never remain frozen in time. Charles also accepted his part in what had happened. The king admitted that he should have spoken to his younger son before the formal confirmation was read aloud. He could not change the succession structure to protect Harry from pain, but he could acknowledge that the delivery had made that pain worse. For Harry, that admission offered something the ruling itself never could: proof that his reaction had been heard, even if his demand had not been granted. Harry encountered George once more before leaving. He stopped beside his nephew, placed a hand on his shoulder, and spoke with none of the anger that had defined the earlier confrontation. "None of this was about you," he told him. George answered simply that he understood. The exchange was brief, but it broke the tension that had surrounded the child since the rehearsal. William watched without interrupting. For once, the future king did not feel the need to step between his brother and his son's future. Harry had made the choice himself. He was protecting George from becoming the enemy, in a story the boy had never written. The crisis left one truth impossible to avoid. Succession moves forward. Positions change. Generations replace one another, and no amount of memory can force the monarchy to remain arranged around an earlier age. Yet George gaining his rightful place did not require Harry to become meaningless. One question belonged to the crown, the other belonged to family. The chair remained George's. The decision remained Charles's, and Harry finally stopped treating either as proof that he had lost everyone he loved. The palace had drawn a line of succession, but the men involved chose not to turn that line into a permanent divide. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.